All right. This is going to be a lively, very interactive, engaged space this morning. So a couple of ways that we can offer up applause this morning is obviously to do this, but we can also do this. This is applause in sign language, so I would really welcome that if something, relates to you, or if you feel inspired in a moment, just to give a little hand or snaps, whatever feels good to you. I really want this to feel like a very open, welcoming, encouraging space. You're not being judged here, you're not being critiqued here. Maybe we kind of create this protective bubble that the space this morning is really for us to get a lot out of this experience together. So my name is Amanda Masterpaul, and I want to bring my identities into the space this morning to hopefully encourage you to think about your identities that you hold and how you bring that into the spaces that you are a part of on a daily basis. So I am a white woman, and that's important because we understand in our country that whiteness holds status and power in this country, and so I want to hold that identity and understand the implications around whiteness in our environments and in our countries in regards to power and positionality. I am a female, a cis female person, and good morning, welcome, hello. A cis female woman, and so what that means is that my gender identity and the gender assignment that I had at birth coalesce. They match for me. And that also holds some dynamics in our culture. I am from the South, so I was born and raised in the South, and so I bring my Southern identity here into the space. I come from a family that worked incredibly hard in their life, had a lot of struggles and challenges, addiction, different things in their life. Also, my sexual identity, I bring that into a space that I come into as well. So I'm married, I have 2 children. I also consider my identity is bisexual, and so I bring that, right, as like a queer identity into the spaces that I come into. So that is me. I want just to understand that you can speak that and name that for yourself, and also that lives within you in each environment that you come into and interact with. So we're going into inclusive workspaces. Why these identity markers, why do they matter, and why do pronouns matter? All right, so you're going to introduce yourself, but we're going to have a fun way to introduce ourselves. So I want to go around. This is for everyone. We'll have enough time for everybody to do it. So I'd love for you to say your name, but then also to share a fill in the blank around your personality. So let's say, for example, today my personality is feeling a little bit like Captain Marvel. All right, so my name is Amanda, and my personality is feeling Captain Marvel. All right, sound good? Anyone want to start? So think about how much you can learn from each other, right? Sometimes maybe when you look at identity from different perspectives, it can actually coalesce people in different ways. It can build bond and belonging, which is going to be a big theme this morning, is around belonging and understanding the higher stakes that are involved with belonging in this type of work of really trying to cultivate inclusive workspaces. So I really start all trainings with community agreements. Now, what's important about this is that today I'm coming in with these community agreements, but I really want you to think about how in your spaces community agreements can actually be a shared responsibility among you and your team. And so how can you actually develop community agreements together? For the nature of this workshop, we don't have the opportunity or time to simulate that type of process, but I'd be more than happy to talk to you about or give you some resources on if you would consider doing this work with your team on community agreements. But we're a community. Right now, boom, you're a community. For the next 2 hours, we've invested time together. So these are some community agreements that we're going to hold today just to kind of help guide us in our process. The first is to be open to different truths. This might not be a truth that you have, right, or that you hold, but be open to different forms of truth. Accept and expect non-closure, right? So we're not going to be able to talk it all today. We're not going to be able to say it all today. There might be some things that are left unfinished or still ruminating for you. And so accept that non-closure. And of course, we sort of actually want that because we want and inspire you to kind of stay motivated in the work. Dare to be vulnerable. This is a vulnerable space today. So I just want to name that it is being recorded. It is not being live streamed. And we did that so that if sensitive natured things came up, we could redact that from the recording. It's spelled B-R-E-N-E, Brown. So she kind of became really popularized when she did a TED Talk around vulnerability. And then she's written a number of different books, and she just came out with her new book. It's called Atlas of the Heart, that takes you through a full spectrum of study around feelings. She's an emotion researcher as well as a social worker. She's been in the industry for about 30 plus years. She's really phenomenal. But she talks a lot about courage over comfort. So this idea around that if we are going to be courageous, we're going to have to embrace some discomfort, that we're going to have some levels of uncertainty, and that there's going to be some emotional exposure for us in order to do the work. The next one is to speak from I. Speak from your experience. Your experience is not the same as other people's experience with the same identities that you might hold. So for example, like my experience, as a woman might be different than another experience of someone else who holds the title of woman, right? So we just want to always speak from I experience. And of course, listen to understand, not respond. You ever been in an argument, in a fight, and somebody's coming at you with something, and all you're saying is what you're going to clap back with or what you're going to say back? Yes, we're going to attempt, right, to reserve our thoughts or what we want to immediately respond with and really kind of lean into the listening. Everyone clear with those community agreements? Any issues or concerns with any of those? I can go back. All right, great. So we're going to start with intention. A dear friend of mine, Franklin Ellis, always says this line, so I'm going to quote him for a moment. So he would always say, there is no comfort in growth and no growth in comfort. And so we'll kind of hold that for us today. Disagreement doesn't actually equal or equate to disapproval. So even if we might disagree on topics, it doesn't necessarily mean that we disapprove of them. And then kind of embrace both and, right? Like being able to hold that, yes, both lived truths can be there and all lived truths as valid. So I'd love to go around the room. Again, you do not need to share if you don't want to, but maybe come into the space. What is a hope or a fear that you might have about today in the experience this morning? What's a hope that you kind of have or a fear that you might have about the experience this morning or the session? So if you want to share that, you're more than welcome to. So even in that, right, even starting with intention is part of the work, right? Because I think we go into a lot of this work by rote. We've been told what to do or instructed what to do or we think we're on the right course, but to maybe take a step back and kind of starting with that intention and maybe holding those hopes and fears, right, is also ammunition that gives us that purpose towards that end goal. So let's start with pronouns, okay? How many of you use pronouns in your email signature? Okay, all right, cool. How many of you might introduce yourself to someone else and maybe share your pronouns at certain points? Okay. All right, good. So that just gives me a metric to kind of understand maybe where we are in the spectrum of how we might incorporate pronouns on a daily use, and maybe why this might be beneficial. So what is a pronoun, right? A pronoun is a word that refers to the people talking. So you or I. So my pronouns, your pronouns. Pronouns examples could be he, she, or they. Specifically refer to the people that we're talking about. So for example, I'm just going to share my pronouns. So the pronouns that I use are she and they. I use them interchangeably, okay? Oftentimes when I don't know someone's pronoun, I'm more inclined to refer to them as they than I am he or she. And I have actually trained myself in a practice around that, because we grow up in a culture and in a society where he and she are very common. We see it on documents, we see it in medical records, we have birth certificates, right? So we have a very gendered specific society that really has created a binary of he, she, okay? So kind of understanding the landscape of that is really important to understand, like maybe how we have a lot of learning around pronouns already, right? Like even my kids, so I have 2 children, and I remember like one time one of my kids was like, "Mom, are they a he or a she?" And I was like, "Maybe they're a they." Like, just refer to them as they. You don't have to know if they're a he or a she, right? So even trying to have like conversations around this with kids at young ages, around more expansive terms that we can hold around gender. And I'm gonna go into it in more detail too. Let's just say as a baseline, it's really important to respect people's pronouns, okay? You can't always know what someone's pronouns are by looking at them. So someone's pronoun might not necessarily be how they express themselves physically. And we'll go into this in more detail. Asking and correctly using someone's pronouns is one of the most basic ways to show that person that you respect them, okay? And we are going to go into in more detail about respecting them for their gender identity, because of course there are differences between gender identity and sex, as an example. So I'm gonna stop the presentation just for a second. I wanna go to this video that is around creating safe workspaces. So let's watch this just to spark some conversation and thought. Can everyone hear it okay?
Many organizations have come to understand the experiences that LGBTQ+ individuals face in the workplace and have created specific policies to be more inclusive. Though creating workplace policies are a great first step, it's important for these policies to be enacted appropriately by managers as well as employees to create safe and inclusive workplaces for transgender individuals. So what can companies and colleagues do to create this environment for transgender individuals, particularly as it pertains to gender and pronoun use? 1. Start by educating ourselves about the use of pronouns. In school, we were taught about the use of pronouns in a binary manner. He, she for individuals, and they, them for plural. But this language needs to be updated to include the use of they, them pronouns for individuals who identify as non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, or whoever chooses to use these pronouns. 2. Do not make assumptions about what pronouns a person uses. Know that just because someone presents a particular way does not mean they use the pronouns we assume they do. 3. If you're unsure of someone's pronouns, ask. Try one of these options. Hey, what are your pronouns? What pronouns do you use? I was just wondering how you'd like me to address you. I just want to make sure I'm using the correct language to refer to you. Note, we should avoid using language around preference. Pronouns are not a preference, they are a requirement. Also note that only asking people who may appear to be transgender can in itself be problematic, so it's best to get in the habit of asking everyone. 4. Start with yourself. An even easier way to start a conversation about pronouns in comparison to asking someone is to start with yourself, especially if you are cisgender. If you identify with a gender you were assigned at birth, i.e. assigned male at birth and continue to identify as a male and typically use he, him pronouns. We can do this by introducing ourselves with our names and pronouns and give the other person the opportunity to do so as well. Doing this in a group setting where everyone states their name and pronouns, regardless of gender identity, can help to make the experience less tokenizing for trans people in the room. In the workplace, this can be done with icebreaker activities that include everyone introducing themselves with names and pronouns. Giving pronouns first, so it's not required for others to ask, is another good approach. In the workplace, pronouns can be added to profiles and other public spaces. For example, in email signatures, in profiles such as Slack or other company communication programs, on name tags, during events, etc. 5. Names are incredibly important. Not every trans person has legally changed their name, so it's important that they're able to use their chosen name at work and that name is respected. Not only should this name be used by their managers and colleagues, but they should be able to use this name in documentation like work emails and business cards. And 6, be aware of gendered language. Pronouns are not the only important aspects of gendered language. Some examples of regular use of gendered language include good morning ladies, or you guys, and even using what we may think is more inclusive, like ladies and gentlemen, is important to be conscious of because it does not include anyone who falls outside of the binary. Here are some examples of more gender-inclusive language. Instead of you guys, try you all, y'all, folks, friends, everyone, people. Instead of dude, man, and bro, well, how about we just ditch those? No replacement necessary. Instead of ladies and gentlemen, try everyone, folks, or nothing at all. Instead of men and women, try people, employees, or workers. And instead of sir and ma'am, try nothing at all.
That might be hard in the South, right? That last one. So just, I'm gonna give some more context, right, in this. But I'm just curious, just based on that video, maybe some initial reactions or responses or thoughts. So when we ignore someone's gender pronouns, this is actually what we're saying. This is actually what we're saying to the person. We're saying that I know you better than you might know yourself. When we don't call them or claim them by the pronoun that they want, your sense of safety is not important to me. So when we think about, right, especially when we're looking at a spectrum of gender and gender diverse communities that are under greater impact in relationship to legislation, right, of like women's sports, for example, or not being able to play on sports teams or not being able to be housed with individuals that are in alignment with their gender identity. There's a lot of different implications that are happening on different levels, federal, state, national. Your identity isn't real and shouldn't be acknowledged. You're saying being who you truly are is an inconvenience to me. I actually have to work to think about calling you by your pronoun, right? Now, we do, because we have sort of had a lot of conditioning around, particular usage of these words. And so we do have to shift our thinking in relationship to it. I want to teach everyone around me to disrespect you. So if I have someone who says that their pronoun is they, and I continue to feel like I need to call them by she or he, right, as an example, or to not even call them by their chosen name, right? Maybe the name on my class roster is Cassie, and the name that they want to be called in class is Finn, and I continue to call them Cassie in class. What I'm saying and what I'm teaching all those other students and everyone else in the environment is that it's okay to disrespect them, that it's just fine, it's acceptable. Offending you is fine, so offending the other person is fine if it makes me feel more comfortable to stick with my pronouns that I feel more comfortable saying. You're saying, I can hear you talking, but I'm not really listening. But you're also saying, I'm not an ally, I'm not an advocate, I'm not a partner with you. And this is someone that you could trust. So what are the benefits, right? Like, what are the benefits to using pronouns in the workplace? It shows people that they matter, okay? It demonstrates respect and inclusion. It is a very basic way to do that. Think of pronouns as the extension of someone's name, right? Think of pronouns as the extension of someone's name. So, was it Susie, right? So is Susie the name that's on your certificate, or is it Susan? Susie, okay. So let's say, for example, that your name was Susan, right? And I felt like I was going to continue to call you Susan when you really wanted to be called Susie, right? So this relationship, if you can understand it maybe in the names, the given names, the preferred names that you like to be called, that is the same with pronouns. Asking someone's pronouns prevents you from assuming or misgendering someone. It displays your commitment to someone's right to their dignity and to their integrity. So really holding people in the space, we're talking about inclusive workspaces, you want everyone to feel dignity and integrity in the space. It fosters a culture of safety. So I'm going to go back to what you shared, Chase, right, in the beginning of like, wow, this is great, we're having this conversation, but also Horry County City Council just did this thing and it's really deeply impacted our community, right? And we're feeling this tension there. What you do is if you can create this little nucleus of safety within the bubble of your workspace and your environment, it helps the people who are being impacted by some of these greater policies that are being done by city councils or by state legislators or even federal level, that those circumstances that might be environmental or political that feel oppressive or unjust, you're creating that safety bubble within your workspace and within your environment for those individuals. DJ Martin, Senior Director of Leadership Solutions, says this: disclosing one's pronouns communicates that our gender is not assumed or that a binary status is not the only way either. Aubrey Blanche, head of the Equitable Design at Culture Amp, says this: for most people, their pronouns simply aren't a big part of their experience. But for people who are constantly questioned or misgendered, the experience can leave them feeling excluded and alienated. So for example, for me, if you were to misuse my pronouns, it might not have such a deep impact upon me, right? But for someone who is constantly being questioned for their gender identity or is living in containers or circumstances of being questioned and feeling like impacted by those circumstances, the simple misuse of a pronoun could really deeply impact and maybe even like sever some relationships. So anyone want to share their pronouns? So I'd love for you to kind of like just engage in the exercise. So I would love, again, popcorn style if you felt comfortable. Now these are not the only pronouns that are out there. He, she, they, them, she, her, hers. These are not the only pronouns that are out there. I've had students in my classes that have used pronouns of Z, okay? So there's others that are out there. This is not an exhaustive list, but I just would love for you to self-reflect and like, what are the pronouns that you feel comfortable using today? Absolutely, I think that's a great question. I've actually engaged in some conversations around that. So for example, I shared my pronouns. I do use she and they, and I have strategically chosen they as my second pronoun because I want to signal to students, exactly like you said, Tia, that they can foster, that they have belonging with me right away. So I think that, but if we're going to open into deeper conversations, I can't remember your name. Michelle, what she said about open conversations in the beginning is that once they get to know the person, right, pronouns are like basic level, like baseline. But then if I'm engaging in further conversation with those students or with that population or community, I can share that I'm cisgender, right? So that's another tier, right? So that they understand, if we feel comfortable exploring more around our gender identities, understanding that there might be someone in the space who is using they, them pronouns, who is non-binary, but there might be other individuals in the space who are using they and they are cisgender, right? But I haven't necessarily come across like an aversion to using they. I see it more, I see it being more well-received as opposed to maybe the issues around like co-opting language. So some best practices for pronoun usage: use pronouns in email signatures. That's a great way to signal to the community and to your company that you're familiar with it. Use pronouns with your name to foster a culture of inclusivity. So for example, hi, my name is Amanda, my pronouns are she, they. As a part of an introduction or icebreaker at work, you can say, tell us your name, your role, and if you're comfortable, your pronouns. Don't ever force anyone, right, to reveal pronouns. just like you wouldn't necessarily force someone to reveal their gender identity. Incorporate gender-neutral language in greetings. So y'all, everyone, friends, folks. I use friends a lot too. I like that term. Think about removing his, her, he/she from documents or policies and adapt them. Adapt those policies to them. Even just reading documentation on the company or filling out applications can be really stigmatizing to people if they're only having to, again, denote themselves within a binary of he, she. Remember that for some LGBTQ+ people, disclosing their pronouns may be a source of anxiety. So we do not want to force that from that population or individuals. Use they or their whenever possible as opposed to his or her. So-and-so, his or her. Remember that you can't tell someone's gender just by looking at their appearance. So maybe share your pronouns first and invite others to share theirs with you. Does anyone else have any other ideas as to maybe ways that you might have or that you'd be curious about incorporating pronouns into the environment that you're in? Keep thinking around that. So we talked about pronouns, right? And we're also talking about how pronouns are not necessarily specifically aligned with someone's gender identity, right? So I want to give you some terminology. These might be new terms. Maybe you're familiar with some of these terms. I'm not going to go into them into too much depth, right? But I just want to give you some context to kind of understand the landscape. So agender, not having a gender or identifying with a gender, they may describe themselves as being gender neutral or genderless. Bigender, a person who fluctuates but traditionally between male and female, and gender-based behaviors and identities. Cisgender, someone who, and yes, feel free to take pictures of the slides, of course, to look at the terminology, et cetera, in your own time. Cisgender, someone who might have been assigned a particular sex or gender assignment at birth that it aligns with the gender identity that they hold. So for example, for me, I do identify as cisgender. My sex is female, okay, but I also identify myself as a female person. Gender expression, so this is the outward display of your gender. Sometimes your gender expression might not necessarily be the same as your gender identity. So let's say, for example, if I were a trans woman, I still might outwardly appear very masculine, okay? Because maybe that's what is expected of me or feels safe in the environment that I'm working or occupying, okay? So we can't necessarily say that someone's gender expression absolutely matches with their gender identity. But how we express our gender through our attire, you know, by the fact that I'm wearing earrings, right? Or I'm wearing a flowy top or a necklace would usually be equated to a more female identifying person. Gender fluid, a person who is gender fluid may always feel some mix, okay, of masculine or feminine qualities. They might feel more masculine on some days, they might feel more feminine on other days. Okay, genderqueer, a gender identity label often used by people who do not identify with being a man or a woman, but actually use it as an umbrella term. This is usually genderqueer is kind of more of the umbrella term for someone who might be non-binary or gender non-conforming. Gender variant, someone who either by nature or by choice does not conform to gender-based expectations. Non-binary, again, kind of an umbrella term. So this might be someone who their identity falls outside of the binary of male and female, traditionally. They might not have a gender at all, might not have a strong association with gender. Passing, so when someone's passing, this is around essentially like when you're seeing someone who essentially conforms or appears more in line with a particular gender identity that might not necessarily be in alignment with their sex. So when someone who is gender variant is regarded to be or passes as a cisgender or cisgender man or woman. Transgender, a person who lives as a member of a gender other than that expected based on sex assigned at birth. Trans people may describe themselves using a range of very different terms. For example, transgender person might actually be also non-binary or gender variant, right? There's a lot of different variations around this. There's a poet, an author, an artist whose name is Alok. And Alok says, if you think about gender like the stars in the sky, right? There are as many variations of gender as there are stars in the sky, and neither star is to diminish the other's shine, right? Transgender man, transgender woman. So transgender man, a term used to describe someone who is assigned female at birth but identifies and lives as a man. This may be shortened to trans man, or you might hear the term FTM, which is an abbreviation for female to male transition. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, I want to say. And then, of course, transgender woman. Questions on definitions and kind of this range and spectrum of gender identities. Just want to bring that into the space. Pronouns are not the same as gender identity, but being able, if we're thinking about inclusive workspaces, we're also thinking and holding around how different gender identities can occupy and feel safe and comfortable in the spaces, and how we can create those welcoming environments for all the different spectrums of gender that might come in and out through our doors. Questions, thoughts? Being open to different truths, right? So maybe some of these terms are really new, or some of these terms and some of these identities might also be ones that, you know, based on personal beliefs, we haven't really had a lot of experience with, you know? Sometimes because of different threats, we might not even interact with these individuals and know that we're interacting with these individuals because they might not be open with these identities, because it might not feel safe for them to feel that way. So before we go into the next stage, right? So this is also about pronouns, but this is also about identities and identity markers. There's a lot more identity markers aside from just gender and gender identity. So we're going to kind of talk about some of these visible and invisible identity markers that we might hold. We're going to do some exercises around that and kind of center a conclusion. So I think we're like an hour in. Are we like an hour in? So what I'd love to do is maybe take like a couple-minute break. Is that okay? Can I do that? A couple-minute break. So if you want to get a sip of water, use the restroom real quick, we'll come back and we'll start with this section. Sound good? Awesome. All right, so visible and invisible social identities, identity markers. So as an example, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just some ones that we can sort of work with and talk with today. Gender, our ethnicity and our race, our religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, our age, our citizenship, whether or not we're a U.S. citizen, our marital status, our educational credentials, right? So whether or not we went to college or we have a master's or a PhD, our military status, whether or not we're a vet, have served, and our first language. Is English our first language? Is Spanish our first language, right? So these are some social identities that might be visible to others and not visible. One that, for example, that I do not have on there, but I have in the next graphic, is disability and ability, right? So we might have invisible disabilities that others don't know about, right? So those are all things, identities that we are bringing into each of these spaces that are occupying. And as opposed to seeing these, I want you to think about identity markers not as a deficit, but to look at these identity markers as a strength, right? So the more identity markers that you have, the more ingenuity that you have, right? Because that's the more levels of experience, lived truth that you can tap into, right? So if we feel really inspired by what you said, Susie, right? Around like, if we can look at this kingdom, right? This is a kingdom, right? Of all of these different facets, different colors, different perspectives, different identities, right? As opposed to having fear or an aversion to someone whose gender identity might be different than ours, right? Or use different pronouns than ours, actually utilizing that as a strength and seeing that as enriching our environments, right? It's also around, let's be real, around profitability too, if we're looking at it from a business perspective, right? Which I will get into at the conclusion around real concrete deliverables that you're gonna get and you're gonna see as a result of really embracing pronouns and identity markers in inclusive workspaces. So this is a diversity wheel, okay? Diversity includes all the ways in which we differ that makes us unique, okay? That's diversity, all right? So even in this space, we have a lot of diversity, all right? Inclusion goes further. Inclusion is actually about leveraging those diverse perspectives and demographics and resources in a way that is beneficial for everyone, but it also creates value, okay? We have been socialized in this diversity wheel, right? And what I mean by that around socialization is that from the day that you were born, you have socialized ideologies, behaviors, thoughts around what it means to be woman, what it means to be man, what it means to be gay, what it means to be Black in America, what it means to be white in America, right? What it means to not have English as a first language. And this has been informed through parents. This has been informed through churches. This has been informed through media or pop culture that we've consumed. This has been informed by our schooling, right? So a lot of socialization is happening where we have learned a process of acceptable routines, mannerisms, behaviors, values, and beliefs of the world in which we're in. So socialization is a process that introduces people to social norms and customs. Social norms and customs. I'll give you, for those of you who are female identifying in this space, what have been some social norms and customs that you have been trained to believe about what it means to be a woman? What about those of you who are not white, the non-white individuals in the space? What socialization, what has come up around race and ethnicity in the US that's you've been socialized around? For the male identifying people in the space, what socialization has sort of informed what does it mean to be a man? How to hold oneself as a man in this culture? So this is an excellent segue into the next thing because Tia said this really important keyword for us, which is intersectionality, right? So these identities are a composite of you all the time, right? You're not only your gender, you're not only your race, you're not only your educational background, you're a composite of all of these identities. So you are your ability 24 hours a day, you are your sexual orientation 24 hours a day, you are your race 24 hours a day, you are your gender identity 24 hours a day. But also to think about like your family plays a role, right, in your lived experience. Your religious beliefs and your affiliation, that's also an important part of your identity. Your physical appearance, right? Your socioeconomic status, your wealth, okay? Your role at work, your language, national origin, your sex. So let's explain this real quick. So I have gender identity and gender expression and sex as two different categories. So just going back to the gender identity, right, conversation that we were having at the first half, what someone's sex is or their gender assignment at birth does not necessarily equate to their gender identity. So this is why when we're talking about diversity and intersectionality, we have to include them as actually separate identities. They are not, they do not necessarily coalesce. They're different identities, different realms to hold. Questions on diversity, Will? Yes. You could, so let's say, for example, let's give an example. All right, so sex actually is not only male, female. So sex is actually also on a spectrum and fluid. So there, I don't know if you've ever heard the term intersex. Have you ever heard the term intersex before? So intersex is a category. We actually have as many intersex people in the world as we have redheads. It's actually a pretty large demographic of people, but essentially where biologically they have characteristics that might be a variant of not typical female and not typical male, okay? There's a lot of different examples around that. So I'd like for you to maybe acquaint yourself around gender identity as a spectrum and sex as a spectrum. So think about sex as maybe more biological characteristics and gender identity as who you are. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, my pleasure. So using this diversity wheel, we're gonna do some real talk again. So some questions that I have for you is that based upon these identities on the wheel, what identities do you think about most often? So what identities kind of come up for you most often? So for example, for me, my whiteness and my gender are like what I think about most often. Because for example, in spaces, I think about sometimes like where I need to lead, where I don't need to lead, where I need to share information, where I don't need to share information, kind of that step up, step back type of principle around my race, and then also how I need to really consciously make sure that the spaces that I'm occupying feel very generous in people sharing their voices of diverse perspectives, and in particular, non-white individuals, because oftentimes those voices are silenced in a lot of spaces that are occupied by a white facilitator or by a white leader or boss, as an example, okay? And then gender, you know, lock my door when I get in my car, look behind me, all the different strategies, don't wear a ponytail, you know, in certain places, you know, making sure that I get home safely, looking under the car, different, you know, strategies, have keys in between my fingers. So gender is oftentimes very present, but also I've been in business spaces where I've been talked over. I have been told that I look too young. I've been called very silly gendered names, you know, and my ideas have been stolen by other individuals who are men in those spaces. So again, gender and race for me are like the ones that I often think about in terms of my identities. How about for you all? What are some identities that you think about most often? Let's bounce over to identities that you think about least often. Maybe that doesn't really come into your sphere. You know, maybe you just kind of, it's a given, so it doesn't necessarily impact your daily life, but it's there. For example, for me, it might be something like first language. You know, like I speak English as a first language. There's an assumption that everyone else around me in the space speaks English as a first language, and so I could take it for granted when there are individuals in the space when English is not their first language. Anyone else? Identities that you might think about least often. What's funny is what I was going to share was, you know, the socialization around these different regions too. So for example, for me, when I lived in New York, right, when I lived in the city, I lived in Washington Heights and I worked in Bushwick, Brooklyn for a few years. And hey, yay, okay. So of course, you know, I would be like, commute was, I mean, you know, on the train, it was like an hour and a half both ways. So much time on the train. So I remember when I first moved up there as a sweet little Southern girl, you know, I was like making eyes at everybody. I was like, hey, how you doing? I mean, yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what happened to me. And I learned real quick. I was like, shut down mode, don't make eye contact with anyone, you know? So it backfired, some instances. But again, like in the South, right, we are culturalized to make eye contact with people. You pass someone on the road, right? You say hi. We're really super friendly, you know. But then on the other hand, to kind of speak to what you're talking about, Susie, maybe there's also some level of like, is that genuine or not, you know, in relationship to different cultures, like with the South, you know, is that hospitality really hospitable?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move down to identities that have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself. The identities that have the strongest effect on how you might perceive yourself. What's that for you? All of these identities are salient. They really are. They are salient. So nothing necessarily, again, you kind of use this like absolute, like nothing's really absolute. You know, if we think about the kind of the spectrum of that experience, right, there might be, let's say, for example, there was an accident or something happened, you could be disabled and you could be working in and through a disability, right, when in your 20s or 30s you were not, right, you were maybe all physically able. So again, these identities are very salient over time. Identities that have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. Anyone want to share there? So let's kind of wrap this up, right? So we started off with pronouns, we looked at gender identity, we talked a lot about visible and invisible social identities and identity markers. Well, great, so we shared these stories, we understand that everybody is coming from different perspectives. How do we really integrate it? How do we make it something concrete, okay? It's about your being is centered in belonging. Right? If we don't know who people are, if we're not having real talk, if we aren't really looking and conscious of these identities that people are holding, they are not going to feel safe enough to belong, right? And we have to consciously build that and cultivate that belonging with one another. So our categories of identity are fundamental to how we define ourselves, right? They are fundamental to us, whether we've done a lot of self-work or not around that, you know? I'll just go back to just, you know, sharing what BJ just shared, right? Around like the perception of what he holds and how he presents himself in the work experience, and then the everyday lived experience that he has just walking in a neighborhood or being in a street or being in a car. It's not like he's leaving that BJ home when he's in the workplace. He's bringing that BJ to work, right? And so how is the environment in that realm creating safety for him, right? And recognizing that that is a lived experience that he is bringing into our spaces. It shapes a person's sense of who they are and where they fit in the family, community, and society, right? Being is belonging. It's learned and it's passed down to individuals of a society. It can build a sense of trust between people, but may also contribute to barriers between individuals. So also, it's not just about recognizing the identity markers, but it's also around, in belonging, confronting when issues do arise, not letting things get swept under the rug, right? The microaggressions or the micro insults that might happen on a level, and of course we're not doing a lot of work on that today, but I'll be more than happy to maybe try and get some resources to you if you want to know more around that. But these dynamics of when little things are said, I'll just go back to something that Jessica actually shared, was around the perception of maybe seeing a client for the first time, and this perception that the individual that they're speaking to is white, and then being confronted and seeing someone who is African American. Is that right? Should I label? Okay. African American. And so this kind of almost, you know, kind of brief moment, right, to kind of reorient themselves in relationship to Jessica, you know, based on this perception of, you know, whiteness is supposed to look like this, right? So, and blackness is supposed to look like this or appear like this. So understanding how to navigate that terrain together as a team, right? Not to let Jessica just handle that on her own and make that just her responsibility to absorb those microaggressions and to resolve them independently of the environment and of the workspace, but to actually have allies and individuals in the workspace to help address that alongside Jessica so that she does not feel isolated in enduring that on her own. Through belonging, we develop meaningful relationships. We're more satisfied, and guess what? When we're more satisfied, we are a whole lot more productive. Right? Like, we will do our best when we are feeling like we are living our best lives, right? We'll work hard, hard, hard. Belonging is integral to better business. Really, it should be better belonging business. Like, let's change that. Let's make that the motto, right? So better business is all about belonging. If you have belonging in the business, it is going to be so much better. It's going to be more profitable. It's going to be more productive. Exclusion, when we do exclude, whether we know it or not, based upon these identities, right? When we do exclude, we actually create an environment of sabotage. We sabotage other people, but also we're going to self-sabotage. We're going to do it to ourselves as well. Belonging requires respect. It values the strengths of the people, and it follows through on intentionally creating environments where people feel safe to express themselves. So again, this is really important about how do you bring this information into your HR departments, into your impact manager teams, to really think about valuing the strengths of the people, but also not leaving things be unaddressed when they do and may happen in the workspace. Belonging equals retention. We are in what some of us are saying, the Great Resignation, right? We are seeing people leave the workforce in droves, okay, in droves. And they're leaving because they do not feel appreciated, they do not feel recognized, they do not feel valued, whether through the relationship or they feel financially valued, and so they are leaving. So when people feel like they belong in an inclusive workspace, the retention will be there, okay? So some strategies, all right, for really thinking about embracing identity and cultivating a workspace around belonging. Consistently ask about the environment, the culture, and the workers' feelings about it, right? You could call it a climate survey, you could do periodic surveys, however you want to go about it, but you got to ask. You can't assume that you're cultivating the culture. You have to ask whether or not the culture is delivering, right? And then when you get that feedback, however hard it is to read that feedback, what's your process for looking at that feedback, not as an indication of failure, right, but as an indication to drive you into more proactive solutions. As an example, ask if they feel comfortable offering proposals or ideas based upon their experiences, or if their particular perspective seems well received. So, you, staff member, did you feel comfortable offering proposals and ideas when we were considering this project? Why or why not, right? So assess and say, like, do they feel like they can frequently contribute? Do they only feel like they can contribute in this arena or in this topic or sector, right? And then when they do offer an idea or proposal, does it feel like it's being well received, or does it feel like it's being shrugged off disingenuously? Does it feel like it's a checked box? Because sometimes we'll ask the question, but then we ask the question only to check the box and not really to do anything further than that. Find links between organizational values and then link them with defined actions. So for an example, I give an example up here. We value at our institution, at our company, we value inclusion. Okay, well, what does that mean for your institution or for your company? What does inclusion equate to as a definable, tangible action? So we require respectfulness, which contributes to increased performance. We require that respectfulness, okay? Have trustworthy, accountable practices and methods for reporting violations of company policy regardless of status. This is huge. So I would just encourage, right, for us, in institutions and the spaces that we're in, to think about the policies around accountability in this aspect. And then also, so you might have a policy, right, around reporting, but then individuals still might not report. So what are the conditions that are making individuals still feel unsafe to report incidents, right? Oftentimes it might even be rooted, again, in this lack of feeling of belonging. And status can really play into that, you know? If there's an employee that doesn't necessarily want to report against a superior, there's going to be some issues there. Cultivate connections among staff across the organization, right? I see a lot of times organizations that are working in silos, right? Like silos meaning that department over here, they never talk to each other except the holiday party once a year, right? They don't even know their name. They might not have ever even exchanged an email together. So think about how you're fostering those connections consistently across the full entity and organization. Share personal stories. Share them. I mean, within 2 hours, you all already shared personal stories. You're going to have connections with each other from this. This experience will never be the same, right? So share those personal stories with each other. Ask for input on a project via a shared document rather than in a group meeting, as an example, right? Use Google Docs. Excuse me, I had a sip of water real quick. Got a frog in my throat. All right, so I work in an organization, a partnership with 2 other individuals, and we developed a community agreement around how we were going to come into decision making. And so we share a lot of documents and go back and forth on that, but sometimes people are more inclined to do it writing as opposed to in person. Make time for staff to design or contribute or understand how they might contribute. Make time for that. Other strategies that you might have or think about? So reflections and flowers. So I say flowers because you ever had the saying, like, give someone their flowers, like give someone their praise, right? So I love that. So what is a takeaway that you might have from today, or what could you praise, celebrate, or appreciate about the session? We'll just kind of close out with that today. I want to give you all flowers, okay, because, you know, we set up this opportunity to have a lot of different truths in the space and to be really courageous over comfortable, and I would say that we accomplished some really beautiful goals in that. So I just want to thank you for your generosity and listening, but also hearing one another and daring to be very vulnerable in this space with each other, to kind of think about the identities from different perspectives and contexts. So I'll leave you with, you belong, right? We all want to feel like we belong. And so again, you being and living in your truth is about belonging. So how do we continue to create these workspaces and environments where individuals from all different walks of life feel really belonging and want to stay where you are? Those are some emails, so feel free to reach out to me, my Instagram, and then also the Instagram for Passion for the Possible if you're interested in any of the work that we do there as well. Just want to thank you for your time. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.